Hello, my name is Dr. Nicole Holland Sims, and I'm an educational consultant with Patton out of the Harrisburg office. And I'm excited to offer the third in the installment around significant disproportionality, a webinar series. Today's session will focus on the PDE equity pillar of practice, self awareness. Please note the resources presented in the series are not required as part of the significant disproportionality process. These are simply to offer guidance should an LEA choose to seek out training and/or technical assistance. Again, welcome to a review of the self-awareness pillar from the PDE Equitable Practices Hub. In prior iterations of the webinar series, you were introduced to the PDE Equitable Practices Hub in the form of a web tour. I would like to just recap and review the 6 equity pillars of practice. They are general equity practices, self awareness, data practices, family and community engagement, academic equity, and disciplinary equity. Where can you focus? As you listen to this webinar, I'd like for you to take a few of these items and consider them as it relates to your particular context. If you are a special education teacher, educator, or other related service provider, think about how you can set professional goals related to understanding the contents of your backpack and how that relates to your interactions with students. I'll talk in a moment about what the backpack represents. For leaders and administrators, how will you support staff to build capacity, to leverage their self awareness and professional growth? How will that also impact you as leaders? The objectives of the session today are to focus again on self awareness, but there are a few categories that I would like to highlight. What does self awareness mean for me as an educator? What does self awareness mean for my school, district, or LEA system? How is significant disproportionality impacted through self awareness processes? And so, as we consider self awareness as a pillar, one of the essential questions around this pillar would be what is the role of educators or staff, or more broadly, you yourself, in shaping the educational community towards greater equity? If you notice with the icon on the left, it's taking that inventory of ourselves and also inventory of our system. And so, in an overview as to what self awareness means in the context of the pillars of practice, it's that all of us, whether we're teachers, administrators, etc., are the backbone of any educational environment, and we are the main line to student system interaction. We also have a great deal of impact within school communities and the impact that comes with our inherent responsibilities. The resources that are populated in the Equitable Practices Hub related to self awareness really represent best practice to help teachers and other staff self review, do that inventory, and determine their present state, whether that's their strengths, their areas of need, as they relate to equity. And so, in one of the first objectives, we talk about what does self awareness mean for me? So, on an individual level, these are the things that we begin to analyze within ourselves that impact how we not only show up to others, but how we react and respond to people that might be different from us. And so, as we think about these 3 issues, one being bias, which could be implicit, meaning unconscious, or bias that is outward and explicit. We talk about privilege. And so, for some, when we talk about privilege, that can be a hot button topic. But when we consider privilege, it simply means societal. So, if we have certain pieces of our identity, whether that's religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and culture, all of those come with respective privileges that are unearned in a lot of ways, but simply because of the categories that we belong to. So, for instance, we may hear privilege being described from a race perspective, where some people have privileges because of their race, not because of their individual identity, but because societally those identities are seen in a different way. We also talk about power and power dynamics that exist within all of our systems, whether that's health, whether that's education, and society at large. So, who holds the power? Who determines what is appropriate and what is not? And that is a form of self awareness when we're able to unpack in our backpack those things that make us who we are. And so, as we're becoming self aware, it's about knowing how our culture, and again, culture is very broad, not limited to race and ethnicity, how our culture has shaped who we are, where we fit in society. That is the first step toward understanding the impact of our values and assumptions on the students who may not have the same backpack as us. Becoming self aware means that as individuals, we're beginning to recognize that we bring all of these identities, whether it's culture, language, religion, ability status, to every teaching and learning interaction and relationship. And so I'd like for you to think a little bit about some self reflection questions. There's no right or wrong answer. These responses are simply your own for you to do some of that deeper dive internally. When was the last time you had to think about your ethnicity, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion? What provoked you to think about it or acknowledge it? How do you respond when others make negative statements towards individuals of a different, fill in the blank background, whether that is, again, gender, ability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, than yourself? How do you feel when you are in a community that is different than your neighborhood? If you recognized your privilege, what did you do with this realization? These are core self reflection questions that help guide the journey around self awareness. I'd like to also introduce you to the Cultural Proficiency Continuum, which comes from Robbins and Terrell and Lindsay, and the book Cultural Proficiency for School Leadership. As we think about this continuum, we can see how not only ourselves individually might fit on this continuum, but also how systems that we're a part of may also fit. For the purposes of articulating the continuum, I'm not going to go one by one, but I am going to highlight a few for us to get an understanding of the overall concept. So, at the very bottom is cultural destructiveness, and this is seeking to eliminate the cultures of others in all aspects. So, from a global standpoint, this would be something like a genocide, an attempt to purify a group of people. In schools, what we may hear would be things like if we didn't have the special education students, our scores would be higher. Or if the students that lived on that side of town weren't in our district, our scores would be different. That is a way of seeking to eliminate the culture of others in all aspects. When we move towards the middle of the continuum, you'll notice cultural blindness, which is not noticing or acknowledging the culture of others and ignoring discrepant experiences. So, this would be items like, from an individual standpoint, I don't see color, I just see you for who you are, which again is something to be considerate of because even if our intentions are good, which is why this sits in the middle, the impact means something different to the person that's receiving that message. And so as a black woman, if I'm told I don't if someone tells me they don't see color, it's essentially erasing the part of me that makes me who I am. Cultural blindness from a systemic level would mean looking at someone saying, we don't have a problem here. There's no issue with transgender students, and not really tapping into whether or not that is valid. So, if a transgender student or group of students are saying there's an issue and we're not cognizant or we're ignoring that, that's a form of cultural blindness. As we move up on the continuum, a lot of places are at a place of pre-competence, which means we're increasing our awareness. We want to learn. But as John Cronapple and Floyd Cobb would say, sometimes we're equity passionate, but not always equity competent. And so at pre-competence, we're in that place of we're excited to bring about change. We want to see a shift occur, but we have to be intentional about how we approach and how we move because we can either go in a constructive direction or falter and stop altogether. And that's why it's so critical that this work has intentionality so that it doesn't become a checkoff. Again, the ultimate goal is proficiency. And we know through the work that we do in education that no one lives at proficiency 24/7. It's the ultimate goal. And as we grow in the supports that we offer and in the practices that we provide, our ultimate goal is to ensure that proficiency is achieved in some form or fashion. What I would articulate on the left side of the screen is an arrow that moves up and down. That's purposefully there to articulate that we as individuals and also systems move up and down this continuum on a consistent basis. So, what I would like for you to take away from this continuum is that there's room to always grow, but there's also the likelihood of us making mistakes along the way. It's being willing to learn and course correct as we make those mistakes to move up that continuum. So, when we think about the bottom of the continuum, if you will, how does that sound in schools? So, here are just some examples from the book, the Cultural Proficiency for School Leadership book, that are examples of what you may hear out in the field. Their parents won't come to parent conferences because they don't care about the education of their children. Why try to help them? They will just end up in jail just like their dad. Why should I learn anything about their culture? This is our country. Let them learn about us. Don't put these kids in my class. I'm not a special ed teacher. And so when you hear things like that, and we think about that self reflection question of how do we respond when you hear negative statements about people who are different than ourselves, we have to think not only from an individual space of how do we respond, but how do we empower our systems to also be responsive to the things that we know exist from an individual standpoint and from a group standpoint as well. So, what does self awareness mean for my system? And so, what you'll notice in the Equitable Practices Hub is that each of the pillars are organized according to spheres. So, individual is one sphere, classroom is another, school and district is another. And I would argue here that these are the three mechanisms of systems that take us out of the individual space. So, at the classroom level, what can we as educators in classrooms do to ensure that when we recognize or are aware of how biases, privileges, and powers exhibit themselves within us, how does that inform our classrooms? How do we create brave spaces for not only our backpacks to be visible and valued, but for our students to also have that same value? That then translates to a larger system at the building level. So, on a school level, how do we recognize and use our self awareness to inform or leverage privileges and power and biases that cannot go unchecked? And that then translates to the district LEA level and saying, as a system, how will we use what we know about our system to ensure that we're responsive to the needs of students that have not always received appropriate outcomes? So, what contributes to disproportionality? It's very complex. And I think from this particular graphic, what I would like to highlight is that complexity. And so many things are at play when we consider disproportionality in general. So you have things like discipline policies and practices as we think about our three criteria for significant disproportionality of discipline, identification, and placement. So when we take a look at that, discipline policies and practices are really critical. Interventions and referrals speak to that identification piece. So, thinking of a multi tiered system of support and how we provide interventions for students. Are we providing them the interventions that best match their needs? And are we allowing enough time for those interventions to show us whether or not there is responsiveness? And if not, how appropriate are then the referrals that are coming in the gateway towards special education? That then also speaks to instruction and assessment. It also speaks to educational opportunity, how we're engaging families and communities, how we're evaluating our self awareness through not only teacher, but all educational staff expectation and misconceptions about certain groups. Any cultural dissonance that we may have, which ties right in with self awareness, where there's a disconnect from what we expect. And that's where bias lives and what we see in front of us. So that's when backpacks or backpacks that have all of these different identities don't match. And then lastly, sociodemographic. So when I talk about different groups of students and where they live or the languages they speak, how all of those things, when coupled together, lend themselves to bias, privileges, and power that lead to ultimate disproportionality. So, we talked briefly about bias, and I want to just highlight what is implicit bias. That's a term that's thrown around a lot. And so, as we consider how to define it, it's typically a mental process that stimulates negative attitudes about people who are not members of one's own in group. And I often share the example of being, when we think of in group, that we're thinking of potentially something as simple as where we went to school. So I'm a Millersville University grad. When I meet other students or alum from Millersville, I have an immediate connection with them. We're our own in group. When I meet someone from a different university, I may not know as much about their university as I do about Millersville. And so right then there's a disconnect perhaps, or not as much of a connection. And so implicit bias is part of that because then you have an automatic or unconscious reaction or response where that disconnect prohibits the collaboration, the interaction, the reaction to that person that you're now meeting or encountering. And so, what happens when we have uninterrupted bias? We see disproportionate outcomes either by race, gender, disability, or socioeconomic status. And so when we know that we're in the midst of a bias moment, so this understanding that, okay, if I've had so many students in my classroom from the same family, and then the youngest of that family arrives at my door on the first day of school, my bias kicks in to say, I know how your family has been for me in the past. And the automatic association is that this youngest person in the family or youngest student is going to behave or react and respond in the exact same way. Automatic association. And also, we can go even more concrete and say, if I say peanut butter, the automatic response is jelly. That's when we see things on television, when we see things in media, those automatic associations inform our bias. And so, what we must be aware of are those biases and being willing to check them, being willing to be concerned about the consequences of those biases, know when they're occurring and most likely when they're going to happen, and then what replacement behaviors can you use to respond in a different way that might be more aligned to your values. And so, as we think of things like respect, uh, inappropriate language, these are all subjective. Bias plays a role in those things as well. And so, what this often leads to are ambiguous judgments, snap decisions, or even unconscious behaviors. So, in particular, a snap decision is where we see this happen most often in discipline. Where we also may see implicit bias is in our own process of identification or in our own process of placement. And so all of these things end up leading to disproportionate outcomes, and we don't even realize they're happening. And so I want to just highlight that implicit bias is one of those things that everyone has, no matter who they are. And so as you think about the work you do, where do you see implicit bias impacting decisions for students? So, how can we respond to bias? This is a piece of self awareness, too. Being able to recognize when things have been said that might be negative in nature about another group, and being able to then say to yourself internally, how can I leverage my power, my privilege, and even my own biases to respond and not be a bystander? And so, learningforjustice.org, formerly Teaching Tolerance, offers a 4 step speak up guide. And the 4 steps are as follows. When a conversation is happening that appears to be biased in nature, how can you interrupt? How can you stop the conversation and say, hey, wait a minute, help me understand what you mean, which is number 2 of questioning, or help me unpack what you just said. Number 3 is to educate. So if someone makes a comment about another person, you can say, oh, that's never been my experience with Nicole. She's always been fill in the blank. And hopefully, if you have another person with you that can do number 4, which is echo, you have that opportunity to engage the person who's made the comment with not just your response or your reaction, but perhaps another person that can echo your same sentiment. And so, even though it sounds easy, it's not, but these four steps can be an easy way to practice getting more comfortable or confident with speaking out or speaking up. And so, as we think about in this very short, brief capturing of self awareness, how does self awareness support addressing significant disproportionality? And so, I offer the following for us to think about. The first one is it allows individuals to begin to recognize their own role and how to shift practices that might lead to disproportionate outcomes. Because whether we realize it or not, they do end up manifesting in a lot of the decisions we make about discipline, about identification, and about placement. And we need to be able to unpack that within ourselves and within our systems to figure out how we can make the shift happen. It also allows for LEA teams to begin to reframe their overall frameworks or approaches to evaluating data through an equitable lens. So often, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent webinar around data practices, so often when we look at data, there's a natural inclination to blame or to find fault with the group of students or with the families, and it leads to bias statements, hence what we shared in the continuum. And so we have to start thinking about when we're at those data team tables, how can we reframe those conversations from being downward spiral in nature, not really solving anything, and changing the narrative to be more upward. And that is creating a whole new approach as far as how we evaluate data and action plan then around that data. Lastly, it allows for the willingness to consider different viewpoints. So, in the context of what's called cultural humility, which means being humble enough to want to learn about different backgrounds, we have to consider how we can be humble enough to understand why identification, placement, and discipline for students with disabilities that may have intersecting identities. We need to have the humility to want to learn more about what those outcomes really mean for them. And how can we start to do a calling in? Having people understand that some of these systems are not being responsive to those intersecting identities, and also calling out when necessary. So, if you're not seeing the shifts that you need to, what does that process look like? When we think of the speaking up, the four-step process, what does that mean, and how can it be translated into the approaches that we put in place to mitigate significant disproportionality in our outcomes? And so, just as a reminder, as you think about what was shared, and again, offering you the opportunity to go to the Equitable Practices Hub for many more additional resources related to self awareness, consider the respective role that you hold as an educator or a related service provider. When you consider self awareness in the context of significant disproportionality for students with disabilities, how can you set professional goals related to understanding the contents of your backpack, your biases, privileges, and power, and how that relates to your interactions with students? And then, leaders and administrators, how will you support staff to build capacity to leverage self awareness and professional growth? If you have any other questions or requesting technical assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out. My name is Dr. Nicole Holland Sims, and I can be reached at nhollandsims@patent.net. Thank you for your time.